This lesson is all about the SQL Server transaction log. In our lesson on database files, we looked at transaction logs from a file standpoint, so you understand that transaction log files are part of your database. But in this lesson, what we aim to do is sort of make you understand what the transaction log is for. So we're going to cover how the transaction log works. We're going to look at checkpoints, and then we're going to very briefly talk about the different database recovery models that are available. Let's start with how the transaction log works. So the transaction log is essentially a scratch pad that SQL Server uses to track all the transactions that are coming in and out of your database before those transactions actually make it to your database. So on this slide, the green page in the middle is our transaction log. On the right, we have our database, and on the left, we have a extremely old PC with a nice CRT monitor that represents our client. And we'll kind of walk through how this all works. So as transactions are sent from the client to SQL, initially what ends up happening is those transactions are explicitly or implicitly started. And the difference at this point is not real relevant. We'll talk about that a little bit later in another lesson when we talk about T-SQL. But what happens is a transaction starts, and it makes a note of that in the transaction logs. And we've begun this transaction, and then some series of commands, inserts, update, deletes are done during the transaction. And at some point, hopefully, if everything goes well, the transaction is committed, meaning it's done, we're happy that everything succeeded without error, so go ahead, commit that transaction. So think of this like getting money out of the ATM. You begin by putting in your card, then all the steps are enter your PIN number, tell it which account, tell it how much money, the money is dispensed, your account is debited, so that you now have that money reflected as out of your account. And if all that goes well, the transaction's committed. If any part of that goes poorly, you wouldn't want the transaction committed because you, as the person getting money out of the ATM, would not want your account debited $100 without you actually getting the money. Okay, so everything has to work together. That's what a transaction will do. So in the event that it happens where a transaction begins and then some error happens to occur, like the money didn't get dispensed, we can issue what's called a rollback trans. This transaction still stays in the transaction log. It's still recorded in the log, but it's been rolled back. Anything that gets rolled back, all the commands that happened in the transaction, so in this case you entered your PIN number, it debited your account, and the bill reader broke, so it never dispensed the money, that transaction rolls back. Therefore, it's like you never had your account debited. Everything goes back to zero. Still in the log, and we'll talk about how it gets out in a second. And then you'll have other transactions that'll run. Transactions begin, okay? And you've got this transaction in the log at the bottom. It began, it ran some commands, but there hasn't been a commit or a rollback, so this transaction is still in process, okay? So that's kind of the state of our log right now. Now let's talk about checkpoints. Every so often, SQL will perform what's called a checkpoint. Checkpointing is the process by where the transactions in the log are either written to the database, discarded, or left alone, sort of depending on their state. So when the checkpoint occurs, any transactions that are complete will actually write to the database. So at this point, right now, say this first transaction was a lot of data that was inserted. It exists because the transaction log knows about it. Nothing is in your data file yet. So if you were to detach this data file and hook it up to the SQL Server, you wouldn't see any of these inserts. When the checkpoint occurs, it takes that committed transaction and flushes the actual transaction down to the database. So now the database has the correct information. Now, even in the state prior to the checkpoint, so if I back up to here, even though these inserts aren't in your database, anybody who's reading your database file will see them because the log knows about it. Okay, so those transactions are seamlessly in your database for end users. So anyway, it writes it in, done. Those transactions are now written to your database. Anything that was rolled back, however, is going to be deleted. So that transaction has a rollback. It just takes the transaction out of the log, frees up the space that that transaction was taking up in your log. And any transactions that are in flight, in process, like this bottom one here, those just remain in the log, and the next time that SQL Server has a checkpoint, it'll go ahead and either roll that one forward into the database or roll that one back and take it out of the transaction log, depending on what ultimately happened to the transaction. Now, another very important concept that goes along with transaction logs is recovery models. And we're going to talk about the recovery models now. So we saw sort of how the transaction log writes data into the database and how data is rolled back and taken out of the transaction log. But you can sort of affect how SQL uses the transaction log, okay? And you always need a transaction log in a database. And a lot of people, when they first see a database log, will assume it's a log, like an error log. Keep in mind it's not. It's this scratch pad that we talked about. So no matter what recovery model you use, you will always have a transaction log. So I just want to make sure we understand that before we talk about recovery models. Recovery models are set on a database by database basis. So if I right-click my AdventureWorks database and go to Property, go to the Options page, you can see my recovery model. And I have 3 choices. These are fully explained in books online, but I'll give you the overview of each. It's not too terribly difficult. With the simple, which is, I believe, well, it's the default based on what your model is. And again, we'll talk about your model database in a future lesson as how you can change these defaults. In a simple recovery model, data, and this will not change how the log is used. Data is still written to the log. Data is still rolled forward or rolled back during checkpoints. But the difference is, with a simple recovery model, when the transaction checkpoint occurs, the data is rolled into the database, deleted from the transaction log. So your transaction log file stays fairly small, and again, depending on your transaction load, it can still grow fairly large and simple, but essentially, the data is deleted from the log as soon as it's written into the database. All right, that's what simple does. Conversely, and the reason this is called a recovery model is because this has to do directly with backups, and we'll talk about this in a later lesson when we talk about backups. Okay, full is basically going to keep the transaction in the log even after it has been rolled forward into your database. Okay, it does this for recoverability. The way it works is all these transactions are piling up in your log. The checkpoint occurs, which finally writes the data to the database. But the stuff in the log is also the record of what's changed in your database since the last time the log was deleted. You can back that log up, and it basically becomes like an incremental backup in the world of Windows. So your database backup, when you do a full database backup, it backs up everything in your database in one shot, saves it to a file. Then when you do a transaction log backup, it can back up just the stuff that's changed because the transaction log keeps track of that. So the transaction log backup will back up the data in your log, and at that point, it'll delete anything from the log that has been successfully committed to the database. Then the next time you go to back up your transaction log, it will only have the stuff in it that's changed since the last time you backed up your transaction log. So you can keep backing up the small transaction log instead of the big database file. And again, I'm speaking in relative terms. But if I have a 300 gig database file, that's going to take a lot longer to back up than even a 10, 15, 20 gig transaction log file. So that's why it's called a recovery model, full versus simple. So in full, you're able to do these incremental backups. In simple, you can't. In simple, you'll basically have to do a full backup. Nothing is kept in the log longer than is needed until it's checkpointed. Okay, so your database file has changed. You have no way to know what has changed since the last backup. You have to back up the entire database file. Okay, now you also have bulk log. This still logs things, but it logs them minimally. It's a specialty recovery model. You can look it up to read a little bit more about what gets logged and how it's logged. But for example, something that's not fully logged on a bulk log recovery model are something like reindex operations. So what that means, I can be in bulk log and I'll still back up all my data changes to my database, but if I run, say, a reindexing operation at 6 o'clock in the morning, and it finishes at 6:20, and at 6:22 my database breaks and I have to do a restore, I can still restore, and actually let's say it's 6:32, it breaks after a transaction log backup happened at 6:30. I could still restore my database up to that point at 6:30. I would just lose the fact that I re-indexed. So the worst case is once I do the restore, I'd have to rerun my indexing job. Okay, and again, if you go look in books online, you'll see all the different things that are and are not logged with the bulk log recovery model. But that's why these are called recovery models, because they're dependent on how you have to restore databases and how you can recover data. Okay, we'll come back to some of this when we talk about database backups. We'll talk more detail about the full versus the transaction log, and a couple other types of backups that are available. Okay, but it's important that you kind of understand how this works, and the fact is you will always have a transaction log. SQL still uses it. It's really just a matter of, do things get left in the log until they're backed up, or do things get deleted from the log when they get checkpointed into the database? So those are the important things to keep in mind and know when it comes to transaction logs and recovery models.